Heyo! Today I'm going to be making a video showing off how to make a basic Lab API plugin. This video will be geared towards beginners and people who are kind of struggling with creating their first Lab API plugin, and this will hopefully make things easier, as I know it can be hard creating things when you're first learning. So first, you'll want to install a IDE like Writer or Visual Studio, or really any IDE that works with C#, as that's the language you'll be coding in. I'm going to be doing mine in Writer because I prefer Writer, but yeah, you can roughly do the same things in any IDE that you're using. So first step will be creating a new solution. I'm going to just name it Lab API Test, but you can name it whatever you want. You're going to want to make sure that you go down to the Net Framework section and click Class Library. So you'll want to make sure it's a class library, language C#, and very important, the framework needs to be Net Framework 4.8. If it doesn't show up, then you'll need to go install Net Framework 4.8, but other versions will not work. Then we'll create, and then you'll be given a basic project setup. I'll link this also in the description of the video, but if you go to the Lab API repo, there's pretty much all the basics of setting up plugins, and I'll be roughly going over the basics of setting up the plugin just because I know sometimes reading, it's easier to watch things in video format sometimes. But roughly what I'll be going over is what's on the wiki. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we have all the references that we need for the project. So there's two main ways you can get the references that you'll need for Lab API. The first is you can go to your SCP Secret Laboratory dedicated server. And if you're watching this video after Lab API is on the live version of the game, you can just use the live version of the game, but for now, it's still in the public beta, so you'll want to go to Properties, Betas, and then you can open it up and pick the Lab API beta, and once you set it to that, you should be able to update. It'll show up with an update thing there. And then if you go to Manage Browse Local Files, and then go to SCPSL data, and then manage folder. All of the DLLs for stuff that you'll need will be in here. The other way to get references is to use a dependency downloader or builder. The one I'll link in the description and I use is one by Jesus QC. It's a really good one to use. You can go to releases, make sure you have .NET 9 installed, and then you can download the exe of the builder. I keep mine in just this folder. You can create a config YML if you don't already have it. Set it up just roughly as mine. You can pick which things you want to publicize. Assembly C# would probably be the most likely one you would need publicized. I also publicize mirror and pooling. You'll want to pick a folder to save your references to. I just have it in here, and then I also have a sub. This is for the live version of the game, and then I also have the Lab API folder. After you have your config set up, you'll just run the exe. If it's the live version of the game, you can just press enter. If it is not the live version of the game, or if Lab API is still in beta, you'll want to type Lab API-beta as the branch, and then there's no beta password. And you can also use this if you're on any different branches. So if you're trying to get an early server build that sometimes are given out to server hosts before an update, you can also put in that branch there and get the references, etc. Anyway, so this updated my reference in Lab API. So now we have the folder for our references. So once you have your references either in your dedicated server or your assembly builder, you'll want to go to the place that has your references. So in that case, mine will be here. Though if you just installed it through the dedicated server, again, you'll want to go to Browse Local Files, SL Data, and Managed, and grab this file path. Once you have this file path, you can use it to reference any of the files that you need. So I'm going to first show you the way that you probably shouldn't do, but does work if you're working solo. So you'll create an item group, reference, and the first one we'll do is you'll have to do multiple, but I'll show you the different ways with the assembly C#, which is like the game stuff. So this was where you'll reference most non-Lab API game stuff like role types and stuff. So we just do assembly C#, and then we can do hint path, and then we'll do $, and we will paste the file path that we had copied, and then do another slash, and then type the name of the DLL. And then Control S, which will save your CS project file. And this technically will reference what you need it to reference. This is not a very good way of going about doing it though, because if you put this on GitHub or want to work with a friend on a project, they're not going to have the same file path as you. So what you do instead is create an environment variable. So to create an environment variable, you'll just type env, and then you can edit your system environment variables. You can go to environment variables. I usually use the user variables, but if this doesn't work for you, I've helped someone who this didn't work for, but the system ones did, so just try both if it's not working. But you can go to new. I usually call it SL references, though depending if you're working on someone else's project, you'll want to see what they call their environment variable name. And then you'll paste in that file path that you used, and then you can press OK, and then OK, and then OK. And that way, anyone who works on the project with you, if they have that same environment variable, they can put their own file path and then use their references. But then we won't want to use this. What we'll instead want to use is, we'll delete this, and then put in comma SL references, and then Control S. Actually, I think I did a capital. And then this will use our environment variable file path instead. And that way, it's a much better way, because then we can work with a bunch of other people and stuff. And then usually you want a couple things. There's more than one thing you want referenced. So I'm just gonna, I don't want to manually type them all out, so I'm just going to paste them in. And I actually have them saved, because again, I have the live version and the not live version. So I'm just gonna take the -lab API out, because I have. And then if you do it how I do, where you want the live version and the lab API version, you can have the folder that goes to the normal version, which is where SL references can lead to. And then if you, for your lab API stuff, you can then just do -lab API and then have all the lab API stuff. So the stuff that you'll want to include, you can pause here and copy this. I'll see if I can somehow include it in the description or something, but you'll want to reference the assembly C#, assembly C# first pass, which will be mech type stuff, and then of course the lab API DLL, which has the API itself, mirror, pooling, Unity engine, all this other Unity stuff, and these are all good ones to reference, I would say. The big important ones are assembly C# and lab API. So anyways, now that you've saved your references, I will show one more way of adding references just in case you have extreme trouble with file paths and for some reason can't get it to work. There is one really jank way of doing it that usually works for everyone. I don't recommend doing this unless you have to, but I will show it to you just in case. You can also manually reference stuff. This is terrible because you have to manually go back and reference it anytime the game updates, but you can. You can go reference, and you can go add from, and then once you're in the file path with the references, you can then double click to pick what references you want, and then that'll add them. But again, don't do that. The preferable way of doing it will be using the environment variables. But I showed you 3 ways to reference your stuff, so at the very least one of them should work for you. Also, I think they're going to potentially include this in the build later on, but currently the XML for the lab API DLL isn't on the download, so I'll probably link it somehow also in the YouTube video. This will just let you see the docs in your IDE for stuff, which can be really useful and preferable when coding and not having to just constantly look at the actual repo for stuff. So now that you have all the references that you need, we can get to doing the fun part, which is actually creating the plugin. So what we'll need first is we'll need to make the entry point to the plugin, which is what Lab API will load. And I usually just call it a plugin. And then something that I prefer not using the namespaces braces and using. So I'm going to change my C# version to C#10. I just got to this place by clicking on the project and then doing Alt-Enter. Depending, though, on your ID, it might be a different keybind. Though this isn't necessary, I just prefer these types of settings. So this way you can keep your namespace as this. I do not like this types of namespace, though, so I have mine like that. But then what you'll do is you'll create public class plugin. If you named it something different, name it what your actual file name is called. And then colon means we're inheriting from, and then we're inheriting from Lab API's plugin thing. For now, we'll keep in between this empty, and then this will be the basic outline of the class. Classes are a way to store information, basically encoding. This means basically to inherit from. We're taking Lab API's class. They did the backend stuff for it that we needed, and this will let us essentially override bits of information, and then it'll use that information. So like we can override author and put author. So yeah, we're overriding the information that we're inheriting from a class, and then overriding its information, and then that class that we're inheriting from can use that information when it's loading and stuff. But before we move on, I'm going to create another class called config. For now, it'll be empty, but then we'll put this class in here. And basically what this will do is it'll automatically load this config on our server, and we'll create a file for it, and then we can create config stuff in here that we can then use in the plugin. There's more advanced configs that you can do with Lab API. I'm just going to go over the simple one because this is a beginner's tutorial, but it can get more complicated in the advanced configuration. And I can go over that another time in another video. But then we'll want to finish overriding other stuff. You'll see here it's mad, and it's because we haven't implemented all the abstract members that we need to. So we also need to inherit name, and I actually prefer my name usually first, so it doesn't actually matter, but public override name. This is the name of the plugin, so mine is just Lab API test. We have the author, public override, and the description of the plugin. Test Lab API plugin. And then that is not what I meant to do. Override. Version. Actually, we'll do 0, 0. Well, that is not what I meant to press. I don't actually need this. You can just use new instead of the type. So usually public plugins tend to increment this version up when like new releases happen. So this would be the first release, so it'd be version 1 most likely. And then we can use required API version, and this is the version of Lab API that we need for this to load. And we can have another new, and then Lab API properties dot compiled version, and this will basically force people to be using the same version of Lab API on their server as you're using to actually make this plugin. You can also specify a specific version with like the numbers like we did here, but I find this is just easier, and will and you won't have to mess with it as you update your plugin type of thing. Only when it'll do it automatically, basically, when you use new Lab API versions. But yeah, you're creating a new version type. See, both these are version types, as you could do this basically, and it's of a version type, but it's unnecessary to actually put the type, so I usually just have the new in front of it. And then the last couple things is I don't actually think Yeah, so technically you don't need to make a low priority, and the default's actually medium. So the difference is abstract are stuff that you have to override, virtual you can but don't have to. So it's not going to yell, like, for this, it's like, if you don't have, like, see, we still have some abstract stuff. If you don't, it's going to yell at you if you don't inherit abstract stuff, but it won't yell at you if you don't override virtual stuff. But maybe we want to set this to be high as our load priority. And things you can do load priority for, sometimes you want certain events to happen after other events. For like different plugins, maybe your plugin relies on another plugin. Maybe this plugin that you're making is going to be like used by other plugins, and the other plugins will need your events to happen first. So if you have a higher priority, your events will be executed before those events. So it can be useful for that. And then the last part is we override enable and we override disable. And this is where we basically register our events and stuff to basically start our plugin. Enabled will be called when the server first starts, and disabled will be called when the server stops. Now that we have the shell of our plugin set up, we can now start actually making some functionality between them. So first, I'll actually show you how to make a basic config file. So let's say we want to send a welcome message to someone on the server. So we can do like public string, and then we can name this welcome message. And then we can give it a default message like welcome to my server. And then now when we load the plugin on our server, it'll load the config for this plugin. And there'll be a config value called welcome message, and the default value will say welcome to my server. But then anyone who uses this plugin can then change the config, and then we'll make it say whatever this message is. So then we can maybe also configure how long we want it to send. So we do like public float message duration. Maybe we want the default duration to be like 6 seconds. So now we have config values. Both of these will show up in the config. To actually be able to send such a value, we have to use events. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make our event handler. So we can just call this event handler. And then I'll be showing you a couple ways to actually go about doing events. The first way I'll show you is probably the easiest way or the most beginner-friendly way. Lab API has a thing set up for events that you can just inherit from this thing called CustomEventsHandler. If you inherit from this, you can then override any events that you want. So CustomEventsHandler, this means we're inheriting from it, so we have CustomEventsHandler. And inside this that we're inheriting from, there's all the possible events in it. So what we can do is we can then override. Override means we're adding our own functionality to something that's in the method that we're in the class that we're inheriting from. And then so we can override, and then what we want to do is we want to send our welcome message when someone joins the server. So we have onPlayerJoined. That's the event. This event, we can put our own functionality in, like sending a broadcast for a player who joins the server. This will run anytime a player joins the server. This is how most plugins will work. There'll be like an event-based system of things that happen, and then you can do things when those things happen. So for this, we have the onPlayerJoined, and we'll want to send our broadcast message in here. So first, we need to actually be able to access our config values. Now, if we're in this method, you can just do config, that's config dot, and then you can access them because config is a value that you can get from this class. Outside of this, though, you can't just access your config, and you can't really use, you have to use your config value in the actual event. So what we'll do instead is we will make a singleton. A singleton is a design pattern that lets us basically access the specific instance. So we can do public static. Static means there will only ever be like one instance of it. You can always access it from, you don't need to make an instance of the class to be able to access it, and there's only ever one of them no matter how many instances of this plugin class we make. So, and it's going to be of this class's type. And then we're going to name it singleton because that's what it's usually named, but you can name it really anything you want. And then we can do singleton. When it enables, it'll set singleton to this. And when it disables, set it back to the default. And this way, from our events handler, we can do plugins. This goes to our plugin class. And now we can access the singleton. And then from the singleton, we can access our config. And now we can access welcome message and message duration. So, in order to send a message to someone that joins, we can access our player through our event args. So we have this event args. If you go into the lab API repo, you can see the event args from here, or you can control click, and we can see that the join event args gives us the player. So EV can be named, anything can be named args, it could be named E, it could be named EV, or anything that you want. We can access the player from ev.player. If there's other things in there, you can also access those. And then we can do send a broadcast, and then we can do plugin singleton.config.welcome message, and then for the duration we can do plugin.singleton.config.message duration. So actually what we want to do, this is actually of the wrong type, so we're going to make this ushort. And then we're because broadcast uses ushorts, not floats. And then, so that looks fine. Config can potentially be null, so we'll do also a null check. Plugin singleton config is null. If it's null, we'll just return out of this. Return basically means we leave the method. So if this is null, it'll never do this part, and then therefore we won't get a null reference. So now this will send a message to a player when they join the server. Now this technically won't run yet because while we have inherited from the custom events handler, we have to actually register our custom events handler. So to do that, we could do public events handler events. So this creates an instance of our events handler, and then we can do custom handlers manager dot register events handler, and then we input our events variable that we created into it. And then in disable, we'll want to unregister it, so we'll do custom handlers manager unregister, and then we'll input events in there. Now this will make it so it registers any events that we override in here, so we could also override something like on player banned, and then add a functionality there, and it'll automatically now be registered since we did it once. This is one way of doing it, though. We could, this is the more automatic way of doing it, but if you want more control for when you're registering, unregistering events, you could also do the other way. I'm going to create another, I'm just going to do like second events handler, public void on player joined, and then you could do player joined event args. Now you can kind of see that the other one is easier just because you don't have to know which event args go with which thing. Overriding kind of gives you the list of how it's like the general setup's supposed to go. But once you get the hang of it, then you can do it this way if you prefer. I kind of prefer doing it the more manually way. But then you could do the same code. You can do plugin.singleton.config small return .player. broadcast, and then plugin, singleton, message, plugin, singleton, and then as you can see, this isn't being used anywhere, so this won't work. If we want to do it the more manual way, we can make another instance of the guns, and then we'll also make a new instance of that like we did the other one. Instead of doing that, we'll do lab API dot events dot handlers dot player events, because it's a player event because it's the player joining, and then we'll use joined, and we'll registering it using a plus equals, and then we'll do second events dot on player joined. And then to unregister it, we'll do a similar thing. We'll do basically the same setup, but instead of use a minus equals. Now, you can kind of see why the first option can be a bit easier for newer people to understand. Some things to know: all of the events in Lab API will be kept for the registering. It will be kept in the events and then handlers. And then depending on what type of event, there'll be player events, there'll be like server events, or actually there'll be player events, the different SCP events, server events, warhead events, all that kind of stuff. Since joined is a player doing the joining, then it's a player event. Something to note, the thing on the left hand is the trigger, the thing that's invoking for what we're tying our event to. If you have a good IDE, it'll always show up in like a lightning bolt type thing. You don't want to do like something like that. This isn't right. You need to make sure you're doing the lightning bolt trigger. So for that, you wouldn't want to do on joined. You'd want to do the lightning bolt version of it, which is just joined. And then this is how you register it. And then you go into your event handler. This is just the file that we made. We made an instance of this class, and then this is just the method that we made. And so we're registering this method to run when joined is called. If you also prefer doing it the more manual way, another way I enjoy doing it that doesn't involve making an instance, I prefer to work in static for my events handler. So you can also make this static, and then you'll have to also make this static. Static just means there's only ever one instance of it, and you can just access it straight out without having to make an instance. So since there's only ever going to be one events handler anyways, you can just make it static, and instead of having to make an instance of it, you can just access it straight out. So you can access the file of second events handler, and then access the method right out. Since I'd say that the custom handler manager and events are a lot easier, we're going to, for the rest of this video, not use it the manual way and do it the easier way. So I'm going to get rid of this. So now we're back to our events. Now we're going to make a plugin that was my first small plugin that I made, which is making it so tutorials don't trigger 9.6, since tutorial is a lot of times a staff role, and a lot of times it's like a quality of life thing for tutorials not to trigger 0.96. So how would we want to approach this problem? Well, in an event-based system, for these sorts of things, we want to either kind of figure out what we want to happen before we do something, or what we want to stop from happening, essentially. So for this, we basically want to stop 9.6 from getting a target added to them when the tutorial looks at them. So what we can use for that is we can do SCP-096 adding target. So, but as you see, there's actually two adding, or like, events where a target is added. And now, how do you choose which one you want to use? Well, there's a very important distinction between events. Most events will have an ing version or an ed version of the event, and there's very important instances when you'd want to use for how to pick which one you want to use. Ing events are run before the action is done. So on SCP-096 adding target is run right before a target is added to 96, and SCP-096 added target is ran after a target is added to 96. So usually, in most instances, you'll probably be using the ED version of the event if you're wanting to do something when something happens. The only time you usually want to use an ING version of the event is if you want to stop something from happening or change something about the behavior that is happening. So for this event, we want to use the ING version of the event because we want to stop the target from being added. So we'll use the SCP-096 adding target event, and then in this event, you can use the repo to get this information. We see that we can access the player, the target, and is allowed. Is allowed is how you basically stop the event from happening. So is allowed should be true usually. So if we do this, this will make it so 096 is never triggered. It basically stops this event from ever happening because we're making it false. We're saying don't let this happen. 96 can't add a target. True would mean 96 can add a target, but it's true by default. So, but we don't want to stop 96 from never adding a target. That'll basically break the game. So what we can do instead is we can check if the player is a tutorial. So to do that, we access our event args, and then we can get the target. So the player, as we can see from our documentation, the player is the 96, so we don't want to check the 96's role. We already know it's 96, but we want to check the target's role. So we can get the target, and then we can see there's all this stuff that we know about the player that's easy, that Lab API gives us right away, basically. So we want to check the target's role, because we want to see if they're a tutorial. So we can access role, and then, because this is an if statement conditional, we can do equals to check if it's the same thing, and then we can check if it's a tutorial. So now what we can do, now we can access our disallowed and set it to false. Now what this will do is this will make it so that only if the player who's looking at 96 is a tutorial will it stop them from being added, and it'll still let all the other non-tutorial people still trigger 96. So that's cool. Now, an important thing about which event to use. Maybe we'd also want to kill a player when they look at 096. Now this isn't a good plugin idea, but I just want to demonstrate something. So maybe we want to kill someone when they look at 96. Now we'd wanna we'll just set the role to spectator. But the thing is, so the reason you'd want to if you're doing something like this, something that you're not stopping the behavior, you're just kind of adding onto it or doing something when the event happens, you wouldn't want to use the ING version of the event. Because the thing is, if you use the ING version of the event for this thing, what would happen is, if the player was a tutorial, they wouldn't actually be added to 96 target tracker, but they would still be set to spectator, because the thing about the ING events is even if you stop it from happening, the other ING events will still run. So this could lead to plugin issues where you didn't actually want the stuff to happen that goes through, but since you're using the same event, it's going to go through, it's all going to run all your plugin stuff. But if you use the ED version of the event, it'll respect if it gets disallowed, and this will never run. So this will make it so only people who aren't tutorial will actually trigger 96 and then die. But that's just kind of an example of why you use using ING versus ED events. So another small simple plugin we can make. Let's make it so when you pick up an item, you become 049 for fun, because it's kind of similar to an 035 plugin that players or some servers use, where you pick up an item and become 035 type of thing. So how would we want to do that? Well, we'd want to do this when you pick up an item, so we can look to see if there's some kind of picking up item event. So we see that we have picking up item and picked up item. Now, which do you think in this situation would you want to use? Would you want to use the ing version or the ed version of picking up item? Well, we'd want to use the ed version. So, and the reason is that is like maybe you don't want to let players pick up any items if they have a certain effect. But if we don't use the ed version of the event to pick up this specific item, then it'll make it so the player could pick up this item and become 0 for 9, even if they had this effect that wouldn't let them pick up items. So that's why we want to make sure we use the ed version of the event. So we can do, so let's say we want if a player picks up a coin, they get turned into 0 for 9 or something like that. So we can do ev.item. This gets the item that we're actually picking up, and then we can check its type. This will get us the item type of this item, and that way we can easily check if it is a coin. So now, if it is a coin, we set the player who picks it up to an 0 for 9, and this will make it so that when you pick up a coin, you become an 0 for 9. Pretty cool. Just to kind of showcase what I'm talking about the ing and ed, maybe we want to make it so ev.player. So maybe we want to make it so if the player is bleeding, this gets out the effect, it gives us the bleeding, and this not basically means if we can't get this effect from the player, then we're just going to leave. What we can do is we can bleeding. We can check if it's enabled. If they have bleeding, then we won't let them pick up items. And then what this will do is this will now respect that this is denied. So that way the player can't pick up coins and become 0 for 9 if they have bleeding. But yeah, this is a basic plugin setup. I will now show the basics of setting it on the server. So first, before we add our plugin to the server, we'll want to make sure our server is on the right version. If you're watching this after Lab API is fully released, you can just use the normal live version. You don't really have to do anything. If you're watching this during the Lab API beta, you will need to make sure that your server is on the Lab API beta. So if you're using the dedicated server on your computer, this Secret Lab dedicated server, just make sure you have it as the beta. And then you can just launch this server through here. If you're doing it on a machine like mine, like Pterodactyl, you'll first want to go to the Startup tab. You'll want to make sure that Special Branch is Lab API Beta, and then you'll want to go to Settings and press Reinstall. And then once it reinstalls, you can move on to adding your plugin onto the server. First, I usually like to have my configuration be release instead of be debug, and then you'll want to build your project. Then, so you'll find your DLL that you have, and then now I usually do things on like a Pterodactyl dedicated server, but if you're not doing it on a Pterodactyl and using your computer's dedicated server, you can navigate to your main folder using this right here. This is on the wiki for Lab API. So what you'll do is once you've found your Secret Lab folder, you'll access your Lab API beta. This will probably change somewhat in the final version, as it'll no longer be in beta. But for now, you'll access the Lab API beta. You go into plugins, and then you will drag and drop your plugin in this plugin folder. And then what you'll do is you'll restart the server. And you'll see that Lab API loaded my plugin. And then if we go back to the folder, we'll see if we go to the config section, there will be a folder that's named the same thing as my plugin. And we'll have our config file that we made. See, it has our welcome to my server and message. Maybe we want to say, welcome to my server, yay! We can change it, and then we can save it, and then we'll use that instead. And then we can also go to the properties folder, and this will have a property of whether or not our plugin is enabled. This is created by Lab API. If we set this to false instead of true, our plugin won't load on the server, and it's basically a way of disabling our plugins like temporarily instead of taking the DLL off the server. So now, since I changed my config, I'll want to restart the server, so I can also type like SR in the console. Sometimes I just spam it. It'd be like this. Okay, there we go. And then, in order to test my stuff, I can go to betas, I can go to the Lab API beta, and then I can install it. In order, for as long as, if you're watching this after Lab API is live, then you won't need to change anything to test your plugins. But if you're watching this during the test, you'll need to change your client to the Lab API beta because they are not compatible with live. But yeah, this is how you make a basic SCPSL Lab API plugin. You'll now be able to test your plugin, and that is all.